work out the way they were hoping?
It's such a troubling development, Senator, unquestionably, which is why we're putting out so much materials. But what I would say to them is it's the same advice I'd give my children. If it sounds too good to be true, it is. If they're promising ridiculous returns, they're ridiculous. If you are going to give them money, you'd better be prepared to lose it. Yeah.
I agree with everything that Chairman Giancarlo said. I also would say this to them, which is there are things like disruptive technologies that come along, but they shouldn't disrupt the way you look at markets for us or the way you look at investing. Pumping all of your money into a disruptive technology has a very high likelihood of not working out for you as an individual. When we see disruptive technologies come along, there will be winners, but there will be many losers. Okay. That's the way it works.
Let me ask you one other question. How can both of you best assist law enforcement and federal authorities to ensure these virtual currencies are not used by terrorist groups or nations like North Korea to evade sanctions?
So we work very closely with law enforcement. We recently commenced a program with the FBI where we actually have FBI agents on secondment with our agency in order to look at this. At the end of the day, the use of these cash markets for that, it's going to require cooperation amongst multiple agencies, especially with FinCEN, who often, because of their anti-money laundering operation, may see some of these issues before we can, and then bring our expertise to bear and coordinate with our law enforcement agencies.
Same here. I would supplement that with we also have a dark web working group that tries to monitor what's going on in that space in order to identify these types of issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, gentlemen. I think you're both doing a terrific job. Chairman Giancarlo, when is the last time you bought a stock, exchange-traded fund, mutual fund, or a bond?
So I hold generally traded funds.
Yes. When's the last time you bought one?
Well, probably before I pretty much put my investing.
A year ago?
Well, probably before I started at the commission.
2 years ago?
Yes.
Okay. When you bought it, what'd you buy? Equity or bond?
Index funds mostly.
Index funds, okay. When you bought it, did you sit down and read the prospectus for the index fund?
Well, I'm not supposed to say this as a lawyer. I'm not supposed to say that I probably didn't read it cover to cover, but I will confess that I didn't read it cover to cover.
How many investors do you think do that? Don't read it?
I think most.
Okay. So what's the point? I mean, we're talking about all the dangers and the risks of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. I'm putting aside the shyster fraud issue. I mean, what's the point of all this over-disclosure if nobody's reading it?
Well,
and why do we want to do the same thing with Bitcoin?
I'll say historically it's been one of the foundational principles of our securities laws that adequacy of disclosure, full disclosure, is one of the building blocks. I will tell you, having been in business, that most business people will tell you they study the prospectus only to see what they can sue on if they need to sue on something if something goes wrong.
I mean, I think you see where I'm going. I'm going to ask you both a philosophical question in a second about how far you think we ought to go to protect people from themselves. But I don't think the disclosure we have right now works. I think it's good for the lawyers, and it's good for the financial advisors. But I think we over-disclose. And I think you can, I'll bet you each have a smart lawyer on your staff. you could go to them and say, write me a good disclosure for Bitcoin. And you would get it back and look at it and then pick 50 names from the Washington, D.C. phone book and ask them to come in and say, read this and tell me if it makes sense to you. I mean, what's the point? How far do you think we ought to go here in terms of cryptocurrency? I'm separating this from the blockchain technology. I mean, China outlawed it. So I think South Korea has too. What are you suggesting, that we just go after the shysters and fully disclose? I mean, is that what you think we ought to do,
Well,
Secretary
Yeah.
or Chairman Clayton?
Senator, I think that is exactly the question we're here to pose and take forward, which is, what is the right way to deal with this new technology? I'm not, as just a person watching it, I'm not satisfied when I see people thinking that these trading platforms of cryptocurrencies have the same kind of protections that a stock exchange would. And I'm very unhappy that people are conducting ICOs, like public offerings of stock, when they should know that they should be following the private placement rules unless they're registering with us. Those two things make me unhappy. We're figuring out how to deal with them is why we're here. I agree with you that we should be careful not to go too far. But for me, just to be clear, for me in this ICO space, it's pretty clear that when people are violating our securities laws work pretty well. Disclosure can be improved. It can really be improved.
Well, let me make this suggestion, because I don't want to go over. Last time I asked questions, I got a little carried away. I think I went over 3 minutes. And our ranking member put me on double secret probation. So I'm not going to do that today.
Like I have the power to do that.
He does. I just, the disclosure, I mean, you can extend the disclosure we have now to Bitcoin, and you haven't done anything. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have disclosure, but you got to have disclosure that makes sense and helps people other than the lawyers.
I agree, Senator.
Senator Warner. I usually agree with my friend from Louisiana, but I think we may be on top of something that is transformational, and I don't think you can separate the underlying distributed ledger or blockchain from some of these crypto assets. And if we had the same rate of increase that the next 2 years that we've had the last couple of years, we're talking now a couple $100 billion, we'd be at north of $20 trillion caught up in this area by 2020. And I think I remember back, I was lucky enough to get in the cell phone business back in the early 80s, and everybody thought it was going to be a small business, and they were wrong, and I got rich. I think we're looking at the same kind of transformation about to take place, and we are going to have to wrap our arms around it. We've talked about some of the consumer protection issues, but we've got money laundering issues. We've got cybersecurity issues. A third of the Bitcoin exchanges have been cyber hacked between 2009 and 2015. I'm not exactly sure what the right regime ought to be, but I would argue that, well, I commend the Treasury Secretary for putting a working group together, but I would argue this is the reason we created FSOC in the first place, that this rises potentially to the level of a systemically relevant event. And I'd just be curious whether you believe, and I commend what both of you are trying to do, but whether this ought to elevate to an FSOC level analysis.
So, Senator, I had the same question you had, which is there's a big rise here. If it does keep going, is this a systemic issue? Which is one of the reasons we brought it up at FSOC, talked about it at FSOC. I again commend the Treasury Secretary for forming the working group. I want to go back to separating ICOs and cryptocurrencies. ICOs that are securities offerings, we should regulate them like we regulate securities offerings. End of story.
Let me make sure, because I've got a couple more points.
Thank you, Senator. Just real quickly, on the issue of disclosure, sometimes what we're seeing is not a problem of absence of disclosure, it's false disclosure. And false disclosure is often fraud, and I think we need to step in there. But just in terms of discussion, as Chairman Clayton mentioned, we have begun discussions at FSOC. In addition, there's also been discussions led by Chairman Clayton at the Financial Stability Board and also at IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Commissioners. So these discussions are taking place at the right levels of debate, but there's so much more to be done.
But, and again, to my friend from Louisiana point, we've got this, we're focused on a lot on Bitcoin and crypto assets, cryptocurrencies, and I think there's even definitional issues here. But you've got a whole new platform called Ethereum where they're creating, file sharing or extra computer time. I'm not sure what kind of assets those fall into. Are they potentially regulated within your realm, or if there is a trading exchange, a tokenization exchange between excess computer time? I'm not sure where that fits at this point.
The definition of a security, I believe, the people who wrote the 34 Act and the 33 Act, they were smart. They did it on a principled basis, and they basically said, if you're giving people money in exchange for a future development of a business with the hope of a return, and whether that return comes in the form of server time or your ability to sell server time, it's a security.
But there have been, and I concur with the approach you've taken in terms of the ICOs, and I think there's been some very bad behavior. Yet, certain ICOs, the SEC has not stopped, others they have stopped. And are you going to go back and re-review the ones that have gone forward?
Let me say another thing about the 33 and 34 Act. When they were written, there was a great recognition that there was a tremendous amount of securities activity in this country, and that we were going to rely on gatekeepers to help us enforce those, and liability to help us enforce those rules. Accountants, lawyers, underwriters, sellers, and the like. I'm counting on those people to do their job, and I've made that clear.
Let me ask Chairman Giancarlo, what we did, and one of the things I'm concerned about was that I think we may have moved too fast on allowing, for example, futures trading on Bitcoin. And I would just wonder, you've allowed future trading contracts on Bitcoin, yet the SEC has not allowed ETFs. I'm just worried that we need a much more coordinated effort, because I think the potential writ large amongst crypto assets and the underlying blockchain could be as transformational as wireless was years ago. And I think we're going to need a much more coordinated effort. I know my time's expired, but if you could both quickly comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
I believe it is critically important that we coordinate on this. I believe that we are all both individually and collectively understanding our authorities, understanding this new technology, working around it. There was a communication amongst myself, Chairman Clayton, the Treasury Secretary, and others in connection with Bitcoin futures. And Bitcoin futures are quite different than the Bitcoin market. The Bitcoin is an anonymous area. Bitcoin futures is fully transparent to the regulator. Bitcoin retail. Bitcoin futures, mostly institutional and high net worth. Bitcoin futures regulated. Bitcoin futures regulated, Bitcoin unregulated. And with Bitcoin futures, we're now having visibility into underlying spot markets and data from those markets that we would not otherwise have.
Completely agree on coordination. Like I said, I break it down into 3 areas. There's this great technology that I agree with you has promise. There are these pure cryptocurrencies, which we need to take a look at across FinCEN, Treasury, CFTC, Fed, and then there are securities offerings that are called ICOs that should be undertaken as securities offerings, consistent with our regulatory regime.
Senator Cotton.
Thank you, and thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance today. I want to continue on a line of questioning that Senator Warner began. So putting aside Bitcoin or other kinds of cryptocurrencies that are based on blockchain or distributed ledger technology, what are your thoughts on the potential value of that underlying technology of blockchain and distributive ledger technology, both to enterprises and consumers and perhaps to government